The final moments of Ari Aster's first feature, Hereditary, are some of the strangest I have ever seen, where this film that has worked so actively to keep you off kilter decides to just, explain the whole thing, the narrative, if not its thematic significance, in a single monologue over a close-up before a cut to black. On some level, I respect the audacity of the way it was handled. Like a studio had said, you need to give us something, and he responded by shoehorning it in there in the strangest way possible, laughing all the while. But I also don't like it very much. That aside, Hereditary is one hell of a debut, right up there with Get Out as the introduction of a powerful new presence in the genre, with an even more striking style, but perhaps less vital stories to tell. And Midsommar, Aster's sophomore effort, has proven that Hereditary's quality was neither a fluke nor is he a one-hit wonder. Hello, by the way, and welcome to the Week I Review. You can call me a guy who sometimes wonders if he would be susceptible to cult recruitment efforts. And today, I'm talking about Midsommar. I successfully avoided the advertisements, closing my eyes or even leaving the theater each time I saw the bright, flowery A24 logo on screen and heard those droning, unnerving strings. Fun fact, it was actually scored by the same man who gave sound to Dragon Spring Phoenix Rise. But it got harder and harder to avoid in the days leading up to it, as irritatingly specific, not always accurate headlines started popping up everywhere alongside unskippable ads here on YouTube that made me mute my phone and toss it away for 15 seconds. I'm glad I did that, though, because the marketing, as is so often the case, doesn't properly represent the film and uses way too much footage from its final 20 minutes. A24 has a nasty habit of putting literally the last shot of their movies in ads, which isn't quite the case here, but it's close. For all my avoidance, it turns out that the very first seconds of Midsommar actually tell the whole story. It opens on a mural, a narrative painted on wooden panels that, upon closer inspection, feature the entirety of what you're about to see. Sure, you need to study it longer than you have, and some things will only make sense in retrospect, but every significant event is there. That's because Ari Aster looks at this film, above all, as a fairy tale, even an opera. This board is like an overture, a primer, and you will see similar foreshadowy drawings throughout. The panels slide apart to reveal woods in the winter, and the film begins. Hereditary was about the dissolution of a family, and Midsommar is about the dissolution of a romance. And in both cases, they're already pretty far gone at the start. Our protagonist, Danny, is clearly in a rough place, and for good reasons, it seems. But from literally the first moment you hear his voice, it is obvious that her boyfriend, Christian, is distant, and within minutes you know he is much worse than that. But after the rather unpleasant murder-suicide that precedes the opening credits, he's all that she has, and she grips tight. And because he is a garbage person, he lets that happen while also making it pretty clear to everyone that he's not happy about it. One of the most uncomfortable moments in the entire movie to me is not, as one might expect, the result of some odd cultish activity or even that murder-suicide. It's when Danny confronts Christian after the party where she finds out for the first time that he is going to Sweden in just 2 weeks with some friends for a midsummer celebration. That confrontation is awful. Because it plays out in real time and you watch as he slips his way out of apologizing for keeping her in the dark and ultimately gets her to apologize for wanting him to communicate better. I hate him so much. Many scenes play out with few or even no cuts. You spend a lot of time looking at faces, and the dialogue is naturalistic in its use of silence and tension. That conversation that should have been the end of a relationship is full of stops and starts as she waits for him to speak, and he says nothing, or the wrong thing, and then she tries to work it out, and the quiet in those moments of struggle is deafening, and the tension palpable. But Christian is an infuriatingly passive entity in both action and Chris Pratt by way of Jamie Dornan's bizarre performance. The only person he cares about is himself, and the only thing he wants is to not be responsible for anything of any kind. So he invites her on the trip. Notably, this happens off-screen, and it is revealed to us when he announces it to the friends with whom he's taking the trip. He assures them that even though she said yes, she won't be going. She goes. He's so awful. This transition is shown in the trailer where within a single shot we move from an apartment 2 weeks forward to an airplane restroom is really cool, incredibly jarring, and perfectly illustrative of how this movie works. As I mentioned before, takes tend to be long, but in between scenes, huge amounts of time can go by and important things can happen. At least as much happens off screen as on, which is partially a result of narrative perspective. With only a brief few exceptions, the camera doesn't leave the side of three particular characters: Danny, Christian, and to a much lesser extent, Josh, played by William Jackson Harper, aka Chidi from The Good Place. The Josh thing is interesting because other than Danny, they're a bunch of anthropology PhD candidates, and Josh is doing his thesis on Midsommar celebrations. It is ultimately the pretext for their journey, though that it takes place at a friend's commune doesn't hurt. Poor choice of words. His curiosity serves to add some context to that commune as he talks with elders about their practices. He is not particularly interested in or even a part of the breakup story. Really, he's in a different movie altogether. Which might have been a profound thought if Ari Aster himself hadn't said it in a very worth-reading interview with Vox's Alyssa Wilkinson. To him, there are like two movies going on simultaneously within this fairy tale context. There's the breakup movie and the folk horror movie. And not every character is in each. The folk horror movie is what most people are probably coming for. They want a vicious sex cult to do horrible things to some ignorant outsiders who disrespect a culture that goes back centuries. Those people will either love it or find it extremely frustrating. In many ways, this is actually pretty formulaic, hitting the expected narrative beats for the characters who are part of that storyline. But it doesn't look quite the way you'd expect, because you don't see a lot of it. Now, don't get me wrong, there is some intense violence and genuinely unpleasant close-ups of a face as it stops existing under the force of an oversized hammer. But what you think you're going to get, and probably want, you sick, sick person, to see, you only do in retrospect, if even that. This gets back to that limited perspective thing. If Danny or Christian or sometimes Josh aren't there, which they typically aren't because secret cult murders happen in the dead of night when no one is around, you don't get to be witness. Your imagination can fill in some of the blanks, but you're ultimately just left guessing. And honestly, you probably shouldn't try to think about it too hard. In that same Vox interview, Aster admitted that he wanted the movie to be kind of confusing, which is a pretty interesting thing for a filmmaker to want. Not that it be open-ended or allow multiple interpretations, that it be actually confusing. And I'll admit that I'm not super into that part of it, because what is actually unclear throughout is the function of this commune. Aster would never call it a cult, even if he acknowledges they definitely meet the definition. The commune has a lot of rituals that are weird, which is fine, but then they have rituals that I just don't understand the timeline on. And honestly, if you figured out how the hell they reconcile only doing this every 90 years with the variety of other requirements that are set, especially any given member's specific life cycle, please enlighten me, because I just don't get it. But not like a fun kind of I don't get it. They didn't explain this well, and honestly 90 seems like a super arbitrary number and everything would have been fine if it was like 9 or something, or 3. 3 is the divider of all of the things. Confusion is a weird goal. for a filmmaker, because confusion takes you out of the thing itself and into some broader questions that really shouldn't matter. The big one always being, does he even know what he's making? And maybe the answer is kind of no, that even though he did a lot of research to prepare, the specifics of how the commune functions serve the purpose of an individual scene but aren't meant to cohere in any clear way, which I think can mostly be meta-explained by the fact that it's a fairy tale. You know, the rules in fairy tales tend to be a little flexible, and if you think about them too hard, you're missing the point. But one anti-fairy tale aspect does make that a little more difficult to reconcile. There is no magic here. Everyone is bound by the rules of our reality, and since this one shot in the trailer of someone floating off the ground isn't in the final movie, I don't know if there was a supernatural element that got cut or if that one scene was just another hallucination. I didn't discuss it here, but psychedelics are a pretty big part of this movie, and the way that the backgrounds warp when characters are tripping does a lot to both bring you into their unsettled mindset and also clarify which scenes are most likely happening the way you are seeing them, and which should be seen as a little more suspect. After going back and forth on this, I ultimately convinced myself that I'm just overthinking it, and that I'm not going to let Aster's desire to confuse me get in the way of appreciating the work that he's done. Midsommar is not the ultimate triumph that Hereditary was, but it is an effective and affecting story about how people can or cannot relate to each other and the awful lengths that they will go to paper over those differences until someone lights a match and everything burns to the ground. Like Hereditary, Midsommar is not particularly scary, and it's actually less unnerving than its predecessor because you have a better handle on what's actually going on, but it still gets under your skin. And it sticks in your brain as you try to process the images and events from those 2 hours, as you consider these different movies wrapped up in the fairy tale container. And you know that Aster is an important voice in genre filmmaking, and you get very excited to see what he'll come up with next. At least, I do. 7.4 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching. One thing I didn't talk about, but struck me, is how weird it was to see with a crowd, because there were a lot of people who were laughing at things that weren't really appropriate to laugh at, and I couldn't tell why they were laughing or how that was affecting my own reaction to the film. I think I'm going to see it again, and maybe a different crowd will sort of change the effect there. I don't know. I guess I'll find out. If you like this video, that's great. If not, I'm sorry. If you want to see more, please subscribe. I hope to see you next week.